So hi, everyone. I'm sure we'll do a little round of introductions. Thank you so much for joining us in this room. My name is JV, pronoun JV, and I am the Frontline Communications Manager with Ironbound Community Corporation and a Newark native. We also have Chloe with us, who will be one of our facilitators as well.
Hello, everyone. My name's Chloe. The pronouns are she, her, and I'm an environmental justice organizer with Ironbound Community Corporation, and I'll also be along helping facilitate this. I can pass it along to, I see Greg. Hey, Greg.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Lemaire. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an urban designer at One Architecture, and I will be walking us through the physical solutions tonight.
And hi again, I'm Megan Bushlow. I'm a water resources consultant with Arcadis. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be talking about some of the non-physical solutions.
Great. So let's get started.
All right, so in this breakout room, we're going to be focusing on the areas of the East Ironbound, Doremus, Port Newark, Newark Airport, and Dayton. So we're thinking about Ironbound section, East Newark, but also the southward as well.
So just to go through the community meeting guidelines to ensure that we're all able to maximize this time together as a group. I just want to make sure that, during the main presentation, we were able to submit questions in the chat, and we can still do that in the breakout session as well. But also being sure that we turn off video to allow for ASL accessibility and remaining on mute unless you're speaking. So just to make sure that we don't have colliding voices happening during the breakouts. If you're willing and able to, you can turn on your camera if there's no issues with ASL managed. Remembering using one mic and stack. So like I said, making sure one person at a time is speaking. And also acknowledging everyone's voice and time. If you find yourself speaking frequently, consider opening the floor to your group members. We always look forward to hearing what everyone has to say, everyone's perspective. Also remembering to please speak from your own experience, definitely an important thing to consider. And if there are several group members with things to share, please use the raise hand function or the chat, or, just being patient on Zoom, and a facilitator will call on you. And please save discussions for breakouts and report out.
So the topics we're going to get into are what's important and at risk in this area. For each solution scenario, we're going to look at possible actions, how the area might change, key considerations, what do you think? And discussion will be of everything we discuss, what is the most important to advance, and what do we not want to happen?
So to get into the area context, we are looking at areas that are formerly wetlands, heavily industrial with an infrastructure supporting the port, which is part of the largest port system on the East Coast, actually, and looking at pollution and contamination impacts in other areas of Newark.
More on area context, the contribution to regional and state economy, the need for coordination with PAN, and J.
And for risk context, both rainfall flooding and coastal flooding can impact large swaths of this area. Tidal flooding shown here impacts fewer areas, but would be at a nearly constant frequency. A key critical infrastructure and industrial centers are at risk.
Continuing risk context, both rainfall flooding and coastal flooding can impact large swaths of this area. Tidal flooding shown here impacts fewer areas, but would be at a nearly constant frequency. The airport, port, and Weequahic Park are all at risk.
All right, thank you, JV and Chloe. So now we're going to be walking through each scenario in our focus area. We'll look at some potential key changes, physical actions, and non-physical solutions. But first, we're going to do a quick overview of our scenario groupings. In such a dense and complicated region, such as Northeastern New Jersey, our scenarios are being grouped by actors and possible implementation pathways. So in scenario 1, which we're calling individual initiative, we see individual entities as the drivers of change. Under the purview of the city, agencies, individuals, and institutions will all act to create resilience in their own ways, adding up to a cumulative resilience building. In scenario 2, which we're calling shared responsibility, we more explicitly bring in private actors and institutions to work hand in hand with the city through partnerships to build collective resilience. This opens up more opportunities for funding, increases the potential footprint of our measures, and therefore the potential resilience impacts. And then lastly, for scenario 3, regional coordination, we see all entities working together under the guidance of a regional resilience organization. Again, this increases the impact and effectiveness of the resilience measures and starts to weave in more regional co-benefits of connectivity, ecology, and economies. Just a reminder before we dive a bit deeper, we're here to hear from you today. So at the end of each scenario run through, we're going to pause and get your feedback, what you like and dislike about the scenario and how it will impact you. So don't be afraid to share your thoughts, add thoughts and questions to the chat while we're speaking, or feel free to raise your hand or chime in if you feel strongly about something in the moment.
Greg,
So
just pause for a moment to switch the interpreters.
Yep.
Thank you. Should be good, thanks.
All right.
Pace yourself.
Sorry. So diving into scenario 1. So what are some of the potential actions and key changes that you can see in your neighborhood in scenario 1? So for coastal protections, through individual initiative, we see this mainly being handled at a building and site scale. So these could include things like deployable structures or movable barriers, as seen in examples 1 and 2. And they can also include things like smaller berms and flood walls that surround sites. Drainage improvements occur mainly in the existing spaces and on existing systems within scenario 1. So parks and open spaces will be utilized for better drainage capacity as within example 3, and existing streams and flow pathways can be improved as seen in scenario 4. As for green infrastructure, this area is dominated by impervious surfaces. There is a lot of industrial usage, large rooftops, paved areas, etc. So one of the greatest impacts we can have in scenario 1 off the bat is to convert a lot of these spaces into pervious spaces, allowing them to infiltrate water, hold water, and slowly re-release it back into the system. We also see in this area a lot of opportunity for green infrastructure in the street right-of-ways. So for example, extra space between the road and sidewalk, streets that may be a bit overbuilt, they can be utilized for things like rain gardens, infiltration pits, and bioswales, as seen in number 6. So within scenario 1, again, focusing on individual initiative, we see most of the actions as working within the current system and within some of the individual, ongoing, and planned actions. So, for example, the long-term control plan, which was briefly mentioned in the upfront, is being implemented on a regional scale, with one of the main actions being a parallel interceptor being installed in Newark. Now, a parallel interceptor is essentially a large drainage pipe that collects from other drainage networks throughout the city and brings the water to the PVSC wastewater treatment plant that you can see in this red-orange outline here. The PVSC parallel intersector is this line coming in from Ironbound here, and we see opportunities to tie into this existing project, expand it, and utilize it for resilience purposes. Now, also within individual initiative, we see the need for individual sites to be protected. So this could be some key infrastructure sites, which there are a lot of in this area. There is the Covanta incineration plant, some energy infrastructure, and other infrastructure like transportation, corrections, etc. So we see the city intervening not only to protect these key assets, but also helping other property owners within the area that may want to protect themselves as well, offering incentives, training, etc. Now, a lot of these areas would be left out of coastal protections. Here, the only coastal protection that we are going forward with is the Newark flanking plan, which is currently being implemented by the Army Corps of Engineers. So this actually starts to protect the Ironbound neighborhood and the areas on the other side of the highway here. So on the industrial side, we see a flood overlay, incentives from the city, and again, help from the city to protect these individual sites. Going a bit farther south into the Airport Dayton area, we see that the Port Authority already has several resilience plans within their current system that we would, through individual initiative, support as much as possible, but essentially rely on their current plans. One of the main things that the city can do in this area is to increase the capacity of the peripheral ditch, which is this dotted line running around the airport. This is the main outlet for most of the water, not only that comes from airport runoff, but that also comes from Weequahic, Dayton, and the southern part of Ironbound. So increasing that output capacity will drain rainwater faster. And the city actually has purview over the pumping station, which pumps the ditch out into the bay and can therefore increase that capacity, potentially look at putting in lift stations to get more water out during high tides, etc. So now, how do we evaluate all of this and weigh it against other measures? So we have this slide that lays out essentially the objectives of each measure category, some potential key considerations like construction time, costs, permitting, but also at the bottom, the level of protection offered. And then to the right, we have the issues to consider. Now, this should help you think about trade-offs, things that you might not like about this scenario, etc. So for scenario one, for the coastal protections, we're protecting key assets and protecting other sites where opportunities exist. This is relatively feasible as everyone is acting within their own purview. However, the issues to consider are that this leaves a large area still exposed to risk and can affect some access to critical services that are in the neighborhood. Looking at drainage improvements and tying into the current system, we see that again is on the easier, lower cost side. It's working within the current system. However, the current system can only do so much. The PVSC wastewater treatment plant can only upgrade so much, and tying all improvements into the current system may overwhelm current infrastructure. And then lastly, looking at green infrastructure, we're looking at the key public sites that can house green infrastructure, but that may compete with some other needs that public sites have. It may compete with road width, it may compete with other uses for open spaces, etc. So that is one of the key trade-offs there. Now I will pass it over to Megan for the non-physical solutions.
Thank you. So while all of those physical or structural solutions that Greg just talked about are important for keeping water out, or giving it places to go. There are a lot of other what we're calling non-physical solutions that are part of the story. And these solutions can help us be more able to adapt and respond to flooding. And it can also include policies or programs that can complement the physical solutions and help shift the way that development occurs or the way that projects take place to make sure that they're more resilient. So we've grouped our non-physical solutions into the 4 categories. Natalie went over these during the upfront presentation, but quickly they're outreach and education, policy and governance, new services and programs, and emergency response and preparedness. So there are a lot of different solutions that we're looking at and that are shown here. So I'll just touch upon a few key ones that we'd like to get your input on. And these slides are also available if you'd like to take a closer look on our website. The 4th category, emergency response and preparedness, is something that we're still working on by having conversations with local and state emergency managers. So we'll have more to say on that at our next meeting. So I'd like to start by highlighting some of the things that the city of Newark can lead mostly on its own, such as promoting and incorporating resident flood reporting. So we also shared the link to the city's new flood reporter in the upfront presentation. So what I'm referring to here is having a system in place to use community knowledge about where flooding is happening in real time to be able to guide the city's response and understanding of local flooding, because we know that there's a lot that residents know about where flooding is happening that we need to filter up to the city to know how to respond to it. So I could drop the link again to that website to the reporter in the chat. And so one of the things we're talking about is expanding promotion of this and making sure that it's being used. And we've also been doing this by validating the flood models that we talked about with information we've been receiving from residents like you about where flooding is happening. So we've been overlaying that information with the flood maps. Newark and other cities in the area also have certain local policies or ordinances that set requirements for developments or construction in regulated flood areas, and also how these developments manage their stormwater. Part of the solution is for Newark to adopt stricter standards through these ordinances to restrict certain uses in flood areas, require more developments to store stormwater on site, and do things like require disclosure of past flooding when selling a home, which is something we've been hearing about, that a lot of residents bought a home and didn't even know that it's in a flood area because it's not in a mapped FEMA flood area. Something else we've heard a lot about is the issue with trash building up in streets and clogging catch basins so that stormwater doesn't have a way to enter the drainage system. So some solutions that could address this are expanding the city's Adopt a Catch Basin program, which is a small program through the Office of Sustainability that provides a kit and guidance to residents to adopt a catch basin near them and clean up its trash. Also, a waste reduction campaign could involve outreach and education to help people understand the role trash plays in flooding and other problems. And then I will quickly touch upon the concept of a municipal stormwater utility, which is a relatively new concept in Newark that allows local governments to establish a utility to collect fees from properties with impervious surface. Newark and some other cities in the region have started looking into the idea, which would allow the city to hold developments that contribute most to flooding financially responsible for it. Some of the other solutions that you see on here, like the Flood Management 101 campaign, the Outreach Ambassador Program, Resilience Hubs, and tree planting, are things I'll talk about more when we get to scenarios 2 and 3. But now I think we're going to pause, and we'd like to hear from you what that we just talked about stands out most to you. What do you like the most? What do you not like? And you'll see here that we already have some feedback from our earlier session in here as well.
potentially get some feedback. Some things that you can think about are what are some of the trade-offs that you dislike about some of the actions that we're proposing? What are some of the better things about what we're proposing that you think would fit well in the area? Where would you want to see some of these projects? Some greening, the resilience hub concept that we spoke about in the upfront, anything along those lines.
While we're paused, I'll switch the interpreters.
Mientras estamos pausados, voy a cambiar.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's no feedback, I will move on to scenario 2. Feel free to chime in at any time, but we do also recognize that some people might not have comments until they've seen all of the scenarios. So as I'm presenting, please feel free to be building up a comment list, questions in the chat, etc. So for scenario 2, the main difference here is to see a change from the individual taking initiative and driving change to a shared responsibility for resilience actions. So we're all in the same proverbial boat: private entities, businesses, organizations, property owners, individual residents. So we see this scenario as banding together resources and expertise for greater opportunities for action and impact. We also see this as opening more potential land for a greater footprint for action in public-private partnerships, institutional partnerships, etc. So some of the actual key changes on the ground that we can see get a bit more intensive. We can see things like coastal flood walls that could potentially be going up. And as we look at the map later, I will explain why that is more possible in scenario 2. And at number 2, we can see things like a raised reinforced roadway, which can be done in partnership with DOT, transit, or the Turnpike Authority, depending on where we're talking about. For drainage improvements, we can see things within this area that we don't necessarily see in any of the other study areas, where we have open drainage ditches as some of the main conveyance pathways for water to get out. So restoring some of the smaller creeks and reinforcing them to prevent erosion and keep their design life a bit longer. And things like on the peripheral ditch around the airport, large scale capacity increases potentially tied in with more green infrastructure, green open spaces, etc. And lastly, with green infrastructure, one thing that we keep hearing is that residents want an increased access to green spaces and more trees, more importantly. So in this scenario, we see the potential through public-private partnerships to open up private land for pocket parks, rain gardens, etc., that can be utilized by the public, add to the neighborhood resilience, and be co-beneficial for public and private. And lastly, one of the main things that this partnership scenario opens up is blue-green roofs. So these roofs help to hold water that would normally just be runoff going directly into the combined system. And in our area in particular, we have many large industrial roofs that are actually set up relatively well for this conversion to green and blue roofs. We see a potential program to incentivize and even in some cases require on new construction these blue and green roofs. So how does this manifest on the site? So as I was saying with the flood wall example we were just looking at, in scenario 2, we propose a continuous flood barrier that goes around the whole entire coast of the Doremus area. Now, this was actually investigated by the Army Corps when they did their evaluation study, but overall it was scrapped because of lack of communication, different property owners, and overall just a patchwork of different sites along the water, not allowing it to be feasible. So within scenario 2, we would bring property owners together. We would bring local business leaders, government officials together to get everyone to the same table to agree on an alignment, to agree on potential actions going forward, potentially tying individual actions like we see at the individual sites into this larger network. So where the PVSC site might be installing a flood wall just around its property, that flood wall can also be tied into this continuous coastal barrier. Something else that we see in scenario 2 in particular is the pervasiveness of green roofs, as you will see throughout and on some of the larger roofs. And we see this as more of a potential program than actual implementation. We haven't necessarily talked to the stakeholders like Amazon, for example, but we do see that since we are all working towards resilience, these programs might actually have teeth. One of the last things I will say about this area is to the south, you see this blue arrow leading out directly to the bay. That is Jasper Creek, which is one of the main overland open ditches that takes water from both Ironbound, Doremus, and the airport area. Now, this creek is currently controlled by a floodgate towards the mouth and is overall in a bit of disrepair. It's a bit older. So through partnerships, through collective funding, through CBDs, we see a program to increase the capacity of this creek, restore its outflows, and overall take more runoff out of the system that way. When we get a bit farther south to the airport and port area, one of the main partnership opportunities that would help us protect a larger swath of the area, namely the airport, Dayton and the area to the north of the airport, would be partnering with the Turnpike Authority and or Port Authority to come up with a coastal barrier alignment that would protect the areas behind it. So here you still see that purple overlay on the port areas as they would be individually adapted, individual assets within them would be adapted. But then we see the opportunity for something like the road raising that we saw earlier, or a flood wall along the turnpike area. Now, this is not necessarily feasible in the current paradigm, but we see a shift within scenario 2 where the turnpike, the airport and port authority, and the city all are collectively working towards the same goals and should therefore be working towards them together. One other thing that I will mention, we would again increase the capacity of the peripheral ditch. This might include dredging, embankment strengthening, etc. But we again see a larger financial and technical need there that could be accomplished through partnerships. The outflow of the peripheral ditch would partially need to be increased because one of the main problem areas in flooding to the west of the site in the Weequahic-Dayton neighborhood is that the overflowing of Weequahic Lake directly goes into the surrounding neighborhoods. And it overflows because the outlet from the lake, which takes stormwater from the surrounding area, actually currently goes into the combined system. So we would propose removing that from the system and directing the direct lake runoff to the peripheral ditch and overland flows. Again, getting it out of the combined system. So what are the issues to consider here? For the coastal protection, again, we're looking at a more holistic protection that goes around the whole Doremus neighborhood, protects the airport. That gets a bit more costly. The constructability and permitting goes up, but overall the level of protection is increased as well. However, potential issues to consider, this requires close coordination with agencies, as I just discussed, and other property owners. That is one of the main stumbling blocks to accomplishing this. For drainage improvements, we're seeing tying into the existing systems and improving them. This again keeps the key considerations of costs, constructability, and permitting towards the center. But overall, it requires significant improvements and ongoing maintenance to the existing open ditch system. And then lastly, with green infrastructure, we see obviously that we can have a lot more green infrastructure sites. We can have a greater footprint of these projects and therefore a greater impact. However, when you have this proliferation of sites, that means that there's a greater number to be inspected, greater number of assets to be maintained to make sure that they're in working order, which is one of the downsides of proliferated green infrastructure, particularly if it is only the responsibility of the city. Megan?
Thank you, Greg. So I'm going to talk about some of the non-physical solutions where there would be collaboration and coordination across groups, like with community organizations, schools, and individual residents. And just to note that a lot of our, if not all of our non-physical solutions are really focused on a citywide scale. That would be like blanket solutions that would apply to all of the areas, not just the breakout room that we're in. So I'll start with the Flood Management 101 campaign, which is a solution that came directly out of feedback that we've gotten about the importance of building education, awareness, and resources related to flooding so that people understand why we're talking about flooding and resilience, and also to know what to do when there's a storm. Flood Management 101 could look like a handbook, handouts, social media, ad campaigns, videos, and more, and could include topics such as what is flood risk, what contributes to flooding, how can you prepare for it, what actions can you take to protect your home, and how can you access resources after a storm. So we'd love to hear any ideas about what this should look like. And this is already something that we've been starting to work on through the video series that we mentioned earlier in the upfront presentation. And the materials could be developed by the city in partnership with community groups to make sure that they're clear. And there can be trainings for people, such as people in community groups or schools, to help them become outreach ambassadors and help spread the information around. So Greg was talking a bit about opportunities for green infrastructure on private properties, and also about green roofs and how there are lots of opportunities in this area. There are also across Newark lots of vacant or abandoned lots that are currently paved over, which contributes to runoff. So some things that we're looking at to help get more green infrastructure and stormwater storage on these properties are things like tax incentives or grant programs and guidance to help individual owners install green infrastructure. Also, a flood overlay zone is a policy measure that was done in Jersey City, which requires properties in flood areas to install green infrastructure when they undergo redevelopment. And this is something that Newark could consider adopting, and it could require properties in areas like this to install things like green roofs. Another idea that we've heard a lot of excitement about is the idea of a resilience hub, which Natalie introduced in the upfront presentation about the application that we submitted for a hub at Ann Street School. So to quickly recap, a resilience hub is a place that serves as a center for sharing information, a place for people to go to during and after climate events, and a place that directly contributes to reducing impacts from things like flooding or heat. So with the Ann Street School, it would act as a cooling center and also has stormwater storage beneath the parking lot. So the city could work to create additional hubs across the city in other schools, places of worship, or community centers, places that are already acting as gathering spaces and could be adapted to do even more. And then the outreach ambassadors or other community groups could help to manage these centers. So I think that's all I wanted to cover here. And again, would like to open it up to see if anything stands out. Also, any ideas for where other resilience hubs could be placed, and also where our primary streets that need greening, where there's a lack of trees and greenery.
And particularly anything that you can think about that would work great with a public-private partnership. I see a hand. Yes?
Yeah, so thanks for putting this together. My name is Liz Valladares. I work with the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, which is hosted by the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program. My question was about the coastal protection flood wall. Is that expected to mostly be gray infrastructure, or do we anticipate that it'll be a mix of maybe some nature-based features and gray, or is it just mostly one over the other?
In scenario 2 in particular, there is not a lot of space at the edge, which is part of, as I was explaining, why the original plan did not go forward. So we do see this as mostly gray infrastructure. We do see opportunities, particularly where it meets the existing Newark Riverfront Park, where there already is some extra space and some nature-based solutions involved. Once it gets into the industrial area, the space is essentially the limiting factor. However, you will like scenario 3 because it is highly nature-based in that case in particular.
Okay, thanks. And I guess the next question was going to be, my understanding is that the New York, New Jersey Port Authority is currently working on their expansion plan. So my question for that is, has there been any conversations related to what their plan involves, and if there's a potential to get them to also look at things like green roofs or maybe permeable pavement, and that goes as well for some of the bigger folks in there, right? Like Amazon, for example. I could see it definitely being a more costly problem for the smaller commercial properties, but a company like Amazon, I would think would not only has a lot of it produces a lot of stormwater because they have these giant parking lots, but would definitely be able to pocket the cost for sure. I would assume more than your average commercial property owner. So I'm just wondering, is there like a different sort of like engagement strategy to kind of talk to those bigger companies and bigger owners?
Yeah, I could speak to that. I'll just quickly switch the interpreters. They need to switch every 15 minutes because it's hard work. Okay, so that's—
Please remind everybody to speak slower.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, about the Port Authority. So we've been having conversations with them as well as other infrastructure groups in the area. I'm not super familiar with exactly what their plans are for the port expansion, but I think this will kind of speak to what you're getting at, Liz, is we've been talking about an infrastructure coordination council. And so we've started to form that and identify the stakeholders. And that's kind of what we've been talking about in our conversations. And the idea is increasing consistency in what the different infrastructure groups are doing related to climate resiliency, and also making sure that projects are integrated where they can be, and also potentially like sharing or creating like a hub or a portal where all different projects are tracked. So that's some of what we're doing so far, but I think we definitely can do more. Greg, did you have anything to add about Port Authority?
Yeah, it's more overall. I would say we have a large mixture of potential stakeholders here, where, like you're saying, there are some of the smaller commercial properties. However, the larger ones like Amazon and that large new warehouse, the corrections facilities, some of the existing large warehouses that might have the means will have the greatest impact also. So we are somewhat purposefully at this stage staying vague, in order to A, not scare any stakeholders, but B, these programs, once we move forward with a unified action plan, would be conceived at that point in time. It would be conceived with in conversation with residents, city officials, some of the business owners, etc.
Thanks.
Great. Anything else on scenario 2 before we move to 3? All right. So scenario 3, again, we see this as the regionally coordinated effort towards a wider resilience, more ambitious projects, larger footprints, and more coordinated projects overall. We also see scenario 3 as not only regional coordination, but regional connectivity. We see interconnectivity of people, ecologies, and economies being strengthened with scenario 3. So some of the actual key changes we could see on site, and you will see why in the next slide, are flood walls along roadways, for example, that would allow for more inland alignments and/or inland road elevation, which would allow for creating a barrier not necessarily at the edge that would give us a bit more space for intervention, and also, as you will see, some space for wetland restoration and green infrastructure. For drainage improvements, again, looking at some larger, more ecologically focused projects that will help with drainage, with filtration, and with retention overall. So we see in number 3, some retention in coastal wetlands. During low tide events, coastal wetlands can hold some of the runoff within its system that gets slowly released out into the local waterways. In number 4, we'd look at something like a living shoreline. Now, this would help with protection. It would help wave attenuation. It would help with sea level rise, and it would also reintroduce some native plantings, oyster reefs, native species back into this highly industrialized area. And then lastly, for green infrastructure, you see some larger, more ambitious projects. I will point out in the following slide where one of the planned regional greenways cuts through our site. And also we see in number 6, some larger public works that can be multi-purpose during a non-flood event. They can be parks, recreation spaces. During a flood event, they can be utilized to hold water and be seedable land to the flooding. So how does this play out on the site? As you can see, we talked about the inland barriers because the proposal here brings the barrier back from the edge to Raymond Boulevard in the north and Doremus Avenue along the west. Now, this does leave many properties on the other side of this flood wall, some of which may choose to protect themselves and stay where they are. This can be coordinated through the city, etc. But on the other side of the wall, we see an incentivized retreat program where these areas that will already be inundated daily by the year 2070 already have incentive to potentially look to rehome themselves. So through city programs, potentially even looking up the chain to state and federal programs, incentivize retreat of those properties at the edge, restore wetlands, and in some cases where we then have extra space within those wetlands, we don't have to just do a flood wall along the road. We actually have the depth to have gradual slopes, to have more opportunities for local ecology, etc. This would also be tied in with the individual site protections as well where possible. So at the PVSC plant, for example, the flood wall would go around it, and the Newark Energy Station to the south of it could potentially also be installing its own flood wall to protect that critical asset So this gets integrated into a more holistic protection system. Now, one of the main things that also happens within this scenario is that the Jasper Creek to the south is still increased. We still propose increasing the outflows and strengthening the creek, but even farther to the south, which you will also see in the airport area on the next slide, we propose reconnecting flows that have been cut off by historic infrastructure, building impervious spaces, etc. So as we know, this area all used to be wetland. The natural flows used to be absorbed into the water table and or go directly out into the large water bodies. So by looking at how to reconfigure this area up here, which is already a mixture of wetlands and overgrown reed areas mixed in with a few industrial uses, we either see the incentivization program making those businesses relocate elsewhere or incentivizing them to relocate elsewhere, or working with those business owners to reconnect these flows and make these functioning wetlands that can filter the water on its way out and again hold more water during an extreme event. Here again, we see most of the same work that we proposed in scenario 2 happening from the turnpike to the west and beyond. And to the north, we also see the option to reconnect these flows now out into these reconnected wetlands. So where there were previously bottlenecks here at the turnpike and this jumble of rail and road infrastructure, we want to get more water out through that new northern pathway. This takes pressure off of both the peripheral ditch around the airport and allows for that to take more capacity, and also takes some pressure off of Jasper Creek to the north of the rail yards, and overall creates a better functioning system with backstops. So what does all of this mean? This is the most ambitious of the scenarios, though we feel that through the regional coordinating entity, that ambition is possible. So we see in the coastal protections that obviously this mix of a holistic barrier with wetland restoration gets towards the hard and high side on most of the sliders. However, it would also have the greatest level of protection and the greatest level of co-benefits. The potential trade-off is that this requires both the incentivized retreat program, conversions of current uses, etc., that may have some pushback overall. And the drainage improvements, where we are overall trying to reconnect the lost hydrological flows of the wetlands. We see this as where the water naturally wants to go. And it does get a bit more expensive to reconnect through creeks and waterways that are not there. However, we will need to adjust the uses on these properties and the potential flow paths of these waterways. Lastly, for green infrastructure, I actually did forget something on green infrastructure. I said I would tell you about the Greenway, and I'm not sure I did. So there is a proposed Greenway cutting through the north of our site at the Morris Canal Greenway, which would be integrated with the flood barrier there. So we see that as one of the main moves within green infrastructure that would improve the ecology, but also connectedness of people throughout the region as it goes across to Jersey City and back up through the rest of Newark. We also potentially see that the conversion of existing uses to these green infrastructure projects would require a lot of management and expertise, which is one of the issues to consider. Megan?
Thanks, Greg. I'll just switch the translators one last time before I get started. And it is nearly 8 o'clock. Oh, it is 8 o'clock. So I will just be, okay, the translators are switched. So I will be pretty brief on this. So the solutions that we're talking about here for scenario 3 are mostly just larger scale implementations of a lot of the same types of solutions that we talked about before, but we're talking about having them be implemented at a regional scale through continuation of this resilient Northeastern New Jersey program, which was developed to create the action plan, but we're actively having conversations to continue the program onward to actually complete implementation of the plan. So this would be regional implementation of things like the Flood Management 101 campaign, so that the information is consistent across, a regional network of resilience hubs, again, with the same consistent information across them. There could be a regional tree planting program that would pool resources across the cities. And then some other things just to highlight really quickly that we've been working on are looking at contaminated sites, since there are so many in Newark and across the region. We've been looking at them as opportunities to integrate resilience. This has also been based off of feedback that we've had. So we've been having conversations with local and state stakeholders to talk about how it could be made easier to transform contaminated sites eventually into pieces of resilient infrastructure. So have them go through cleanup, and then while that process is going on, integrate stormwater management and potentially have them turn into parks with possible flood barriers. So there are sites that have done this, like the Southwest Resiliency Park in Hoboken. And so what we've been trying to do is come up with ways for this to be done more often, make it easier and a streamlined process, and to identify sites where this would be ideal, so that there's a pipeline of sites for that. And then one other thing to touch upon again is the long-term control plan. And so we've been having conversations with the different utilities to make sure that their projects that are part of the long-term control plan are considering climate change, and also to ensure that our plan is aligned with what's being proposed there, and to maximize the storage and flood mitigation benefits from those projects, as Greg talked about. So I think that's all that I'll cover. So before we part, oh, and I just saw that we were joined by Director Deem. Welcome. Thank you for joining. But yeah, so we would like to hear, I guess, what stands out the most from all of this, and also interested in hearing your feedback on how we've presented this and how we can make it easier to kind of digest and be able to provide feedback on.
And at this stage, please feel free to give feedback on just scenario 3, on your thoughts about all of them compared to each other, which you like best, which you like worse, and why. Keeping in mind that we will not be necessarily choosing one pure scenario to go forward. It will be a conglomeration of the best pieces of each that can work together.
So this is definitely, like you mentioned, I think the hardest strategy of all, but I think it's definitely worth it, right? Because I think it produces the most benefits. But I did also just have a quick question, and I think you might have mentioned this during the previous scenario as well. Did the coastal protection actions involve dredging at all? Or I think I might have heard dredging in there somewhere. And the reason why I ask is just I'm curious to know if there's been like any conversation about the upcoming Lower Passaic River cleanup, since this also falls within those boundaries. I think I also saw something in regards to Newark Bay, and so since both of those are Superfund sites, I'm curious to know if there's been any conversation about sort of working in synergy, I guess, with those folks as well.
Yeah, Liz, we met with you a few months ago at this point. I guess
while
it might
back,
make sense. Yeah, it might make sense for us to set up another meeting and just like connect and circle back on that, and also see if you have any updates.
I think the best way to kind of keep up to date on that is just joining one of the community advisory group meetings. We call them the Passaic River CAGs. I'm going to add the website to that. We meet every other month, and so the next meeting is actually May 12th. So I think if the facilitator for that is Doug, forgetting his last name now, but he basically is a facilitator put there by EPA. It might be a good idea to maybe hear about the status of this project for, as part of that group too, because I think they'd be really interested in hearing more about it.
Okay, yeah, we can follow up with you on that afterwards.
Sure. And to answer your dredging question, I did say it in reference to the peripheral ditch and Jasper Creek to increase those outflows.
Gotcha. Thanks for the clarification.
And yeah, here is our wrap-up slide. If there's any other thoughts on the scenarios in general, what do you think is the most important to advance in this area? You can choose from any or all of the scenarios. What do you want to make sure does or does not happen? We want to hear your voice.
I'll drop into the chat some links that we have for a post-meeting survey, also to the materials that we have on our website, and then also to a survey where you can provide specific feedback on those materials. Let me just pull that. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thanks for coming.